information. This is really important for you to maintain confidentiality of information. Now, another part of the personnel agreement is the non-compete agreement. The non-compete agreement means that we want to make sure that no one can actually compete with our organization. So what we basically do is that we sign a non-compete agreement with our employees. They're exposed to the way we do businesses, but they're not allowed to take this information and start their own business and compete with us. I know in different parts of the world, and especially Israel, some will say that this will not hold in court because of the freedom of employment, the freedom of property, if you may. Everybody can start their own business. Everybody's free to work on their own. And yes, this is true for Israel, but it's not true for the CISSP, which is US-based, which the non-compete agreement will hold. The third one is a non-solicitation agreement. This non-solicitation is for someone to make sure someone will not draw employees or clients from the workplace, the company that they used to work for their own business or somebody else's business. So when a salesperson leaves the company, we don't want that salesperson to reach out to our existing clients and draw them to work in another client. So this is a non-solicitation. So going over the three, the non-disclosure agreement means that we want to maintain confidentiality. The non-compete agreement means that we want to stay ahead of the game and keep our business on top of that industry. And the non-solicitation agreement, that means that we don't want to have any sort of personnel leakage, if you may, clients or employees to another company, another competing company. And if we look at it from the 30,000 feet perspective, we look for controls or checklists for new employees in any organizations. We can see the job descriptions. It's important to mention security in your job description, job classification and responsibilities, background checks and screening of candidates, and of course the agreements between the employee and the employer. When we look at personnel controls, and this is relevant for the banking industry, mainly banking industry or any industry that deals with money, that actually sells money, these personnel controls comes to life when we want to cross them between each other to detect potential fraud. So for example, if we do the separation of duties, means that no one personnel, no one employee can close a business cycle on their own. They need one needs to create the need for something, the other one approves, and the third one goes out and purchase this service, if you may. Least privileges is for someone to not be able to touch anything or know anything without the need for them to actually act on whatever role they have in the business. And then the job rotations, as we mentioned before, creates redundancy, but also when switching places between two people, one can now detect potential fraud or theft or anything that is not kosher, quote unquote, in the business. And then the mandatory vacations, we mentioned that as well in the last session. So if you look at all this four together, for a bank, for example, to implement this four together with their personnel, and regardless of their role, and of course, the more sensitive the role are, the more controls like this we expect to see. But for a bank, for example, to implement these controls means that they're doing everything they can to minimize the risk for fraud. So in your questions, in your CISSP, when the question speaks about fraud in the banking industry, I would highly recommend to think about this four, because this four can close the loop on potential fraud. Now, the end of the employment or the termination of employment of someone can be not a very nice experience, but it's a thing that we need to deal with from a security perspective, because when people leave the organization, there's the risk of them maintaining or keeping the existing access to whatever information they had access when they worked for the organization. So this is something we don't want to have. We want to everybody to have access to the information that they need to do their job. And when they don't need to do their job anymore for the organization, we want them to live in peace and quiet, but not, and also not to have any more access more than what they need to. And also, when the termination of employment comes to hand, when it happens, then it's important to also make sure that the physical security is maintained. So people are escorted outside the facility. So again, it's not important. It's not enough for a CISSP to think only about closing their logical access, but also about the physical access. So yes, we close the user, we disable the user access for that employee that got laid off, unfortunately, but we also made sure that they don't have physical access, okay? Because physical access kind of rules every other control out. And then again, when you monitor your employees, make sure they know about it. Make sure they are aware and they don't have the expectation for privacy anywhere in the organization that you didn't intend for them to have privacy. Certain organizations worldwide have private rooms, so people can actually go and be on their own in a certain room, very small area, contained area, but in that area they expect to have privacy so they can deal with whatever they want on their personal life. But without these designated areas, as a CISSP, I wouldn't ask any employee to expect any amount of privacy when they're working in the organization and on the organization's systems. Let's look at the chat room to see if we have any questions so far. I don't see any questions, but if you do have any question, please feel free to reach out on the chat. Okay, next topic. Next topic is the risk as we define it in the CISSP, the core of everything we do in security. When we do security, and we talk about general security as well, we basically choose from options, various options of loss, of impact, of something bad to happen. So imagine this, any business that decided to do business outside the country, before they do that, they will look at the landscape of things that are about to fall down, things that will not work properly. So this is the responsible way of doing business when you look at the risks and you measure your options, or you consider your options. So when we look at the CISSP and the CISSP approach to risks, remember the businesses care about businesses. This is the headline of this slide, and it's really important. Businesses do not care about the environment that much, even though the CISSP wants us to think green and to care about the environment, and we will get to that when we talk about physical controls or physical security and the Halon gas and the fact that we don't use it because it affects the environment. Bottom line, businesses care about businesses. This comes before anything else, unless it's human safety, it's people's safety. And as we mentioned in the first session, people's safety comes first. And then everything is about the business. Ethical business, of course. Now, risk is this. This is the formula of risk that you need to know of to pass your CISSP. So in my frontal sessions, when I do this bootcamp face-to-face with groups all over the world, I mention this as the whiteboard. This is a whiteboard for us as CISSP candidate to memorize before we go into the exam. Why the word whiteboard? Because in your CISSP exam, you will have a small whiteboard, an A4 whiteboard, and a marker that you can write anything you want on that whiteboard. I highly recommend to memorize these whiteboards, and we will have them from time to time. They will give you enough information to deal with whatever topic under that whiteboard. For example, this one for risk definition, they will give you enough information to deal with the question. So my recommendation, memorize the whiteboards. And this is our first and maybe even the main whiteboard of the CISSP. So what we say here is the risk equals impact times probability. That means that any risk with an impact, with something bad that can happen, the worst thing that can happen, and then the probability of it to happen, together, when we multiply them, we get a risk. So if the impact is 0, yet probability is 100% of something to happen, but the impact is 0, I don't get affected at all in my organization, then I have no risk. So if for example, we talk about an earthquake, God forbid, and things will go bad and it's an earthquake, 8 point whatever, the worst scenario that you can imagine, but you don't have an impact on your organization because your organization is 100% in the cloud. That means that you have full redundancy, you full backup. Earthquake in one side of the world would not affect your business in the other side of the world. I hope it makes sense, but think about it in this way. Any risk will exist if we have the damage and the percentage of it to happen. So it exists if only these two can coexist, can be identified. If we bring down probability to 0, yet the impact, the potential impact is, I don't know, $100 million, but probability is 0, that means that we have no risk. Okay, so the question comes down to how do we do that? So the risk is, again, comprised from the impact times probability. So if we look at the impact side, the left side, we have the qualitative impact or the quantitative impact. So the qualitative impact is high, medium, and low, and quantitative impact is money. This side of the equation, we basically get from the business. We, as CISSP, as security personnel, we don't put the impact numbers, or we don't put the impact values. Okay, this comes from the business, and it comes from business impact analysis, and we will speak about that later on. It comes from quantitative risk analysis, which can take place in any type of organization, not necessarily financial, but this comes from the business. Now, the other side, the probability, is the stuff that we can actually work on. But this one is also divided to 2. First part of it is the threats. And in this one, you can see the little guy trying to steal money, the thief that is trying to steal money. But if that thief will not have the open window, the vulnerability on the other side, then this threat is useless. So if we're breaking down probability into 2, the threat on the other side and the vulnerability on the other side, then we, as we can see, these two needs to coexist in order for us to have any type of probability. And then if they don't exist, then probability comes down to 0. And what happens to the risk when probability comes to 0 is that the risk does not exist. So again, we minimize the area that we want to deal with, which is now vulnerabilities. The difference between a threat and a vulnerability is that on a threat, we cannot control. Even if it's a disgruntled employee, someone on the inside sitting in the organization, we can imagine that employee doing some bad stuff to the organization. And when CISSP asks us a question about employees and how do we maintain security with them, the obvious answer is security awareness. But this will not hold for a disgruntled employee, because a disgruntled employee already decided that they work against the organization. And since they decided, not even the best awareness training or phishing complaint will not stop them from doing the bad things against the organization. That's why they're called threats. An earthquake is a threat. We cannot control them. On the other side, we have vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are always under our control, 100% under our control. The threats are 0% under our control, and the vulnerabilities are 100% under our control. And what do we do against vulnerabilities? We patch, we put compensating controls, we put all these 3 types of controls, and this is actually the main business of a CISSP. Any question in your CISSP will ask you eventually, will ask you or direct you or tell you a story about the controls. Physical controls, technical controls, or administrative controls. And what I want you to take from this slide is the understanding that in the CISSP, each one of these controls family or categories each one of them is can only have up to 33% of your 100% security. So we cannot rely on just technical controls to exist and protect us from any type of threat. We need to have the layered security, as mentioned before, layered security, which is comprised from physical controls, technical controls, and administrative controls all together. Okay, so the firewall is behind closed doors and confined area, and we have 2 administrators working on it. Each one of them has their own username, and they don't use a common or generic username. This is the administrative, this is the policy of how the administrators are working on the firewall, which is a technical control, and the fact that this firewall is behind closed door and behind a certain area in the building is creating the physical control. All these 3 together coexist and create the 100% security that we want around this vulnerability of someone compromising our firewall, which will create eventually the probability, and with the impact, together we will have a risk of our network being compromised. So I hope it makes sense, but we will get back to this a lot during this bootcamp because this is the basic of everything we do in CISSP. The game of the CISSP is the game of controls. And remember, controls can only be implemented against vulnerabilities. We cannot implement controls against threat. And I know some of you now say that, oh, well, there are controls against threats. Yes, there are controls to monitor threats, much like there are controls to monitor earthquake or the activity of hackers, but we cannot control them. So don't fall into that pit that ISC is preparing for us. We cannot control threats. We can only control vulnerabilities. Okay, so from all this formula, it all comes down to how do we control our vulnerabilities. Now, any risk management will, at the end of the day, what we do in risk management is we balance the cost and benefit. We consider the cost and benefit of everything we do. For example, if we decided that we're going to protect ourselves against an earthquake and we decided to have a redundancy site, then that means that this redundancy site or DRP or any DR site will not cost them what management is expecting to spend on this remote risk of losing the computerized capability to operate under that risk of an earthquake getting materialized. I hope it makes sense, but we will speak about this a lot more in later stages. So how do we do that? In order for us to manage our risks, we first need to identify our assets. And the assets can be anything that the organization makes money from. So when you say assets, think about any type of asset that can hold an information. So in your CISSP, it's not expected from you to protect all assets of the organization. For example, you do not need to protect the organization's furniture or physical facilities if they don't relate to information. You're expected to protect assets that relate or hold your information. For example, in your network, any network, you can say, or one organization can say that, okay, we want to protect our network because it serves a lot of people out there, and it's really important. Okay, it comes down to the issuing the bill, the numbers of how much money we need to spend on protecting that network, and then management can say, okay, this is too much for us. So what do? We go down and minimize it to certain hosts. We look at the host and we say, okay, this to protect this host, we need to spend this much money, and then management says this is too much for us, so we narrow it down to application, and then from application, if it's not sufficient, then we do protection on the information itself. So it's important to look at it from outside to inside, and it all comes down to the bottom line of where do I have my sensitive information in what kind of system, what kind of application, what kind of network, because I cannot protect everything. So when you evaluate your assets, ask yourself, what will be the impact if this asset were unavailable? So we're talking about availability. Okay, this is the destruction that we talked about in previous sessions. And then what will be the impact if the data is breached, if the data is outside the organization in an unauthorized hands or unauthorized access by someone? This is confidentiality. This is the disclosure of information. And what would be the impact if the data associated with the asset? This is important. The data associated with the asset. I can have an asset which is a table that holds certain data. This table is really important because of the data, not because of the table. And then we ask what will happen if this data was altered? So with no authorization of alteration. So what do? This is data alteration, which means that we need controls for data integrity. And then when you do try to cover all your assets, and this is, I know it's funny a little bit to some of you, but ask yourself this, what can happen? What could really happen? This is our risk scenario. And now, is it really going to happen? You know, I have this scenario in my mind of an asteroid colliding Earth and this and that and all these bad things that can happen, but can it really happen? And then if it happens, how bad would it be for my organization? What would be my impact? And then the bottom line is, you know, what can make it better? I know the risk scenario is out there. I know the probability is something that I need to consider, and then the impact can be really bad. So all I'm left with is my controls. What can make it better? So this is really the question that you need to ask yourself during your CISSP exam. What can make the situation better? Any CISSP question, if you address it with what can make it better, I can assure you that you can minimize the answers from 4 to at least 3, maybe even 2, by just asking this question. Now, going back to our threats, again, the important thing to remember about threats, and in your CISSP book, they will speak a lot about threats, and threats coming from the outside and from the darknet and from thieves, physical threats and all this and all that. But remember the main thing about a threat. When we talk about a threat, it's something that is out of our control. It's not something we can control. It's probably not even something we want to control or we want to spend money in order to control, because we can't. And then when you do your risk assessment, all you can do is think like you're a hacker. So when we talked about threat modeling, this relates to threat modeling, the threat assessment. You want to think like you're a hacker, but with no real vulnerabilities, it doesn't matter what your threats are. If you don't have your vulnerabilities, then those threats become irrelevant to you. And again, threats are always under your control. Even if you don't know about these threats, even if these threats are what we call 0-day, and we will speak about that shortly, then it's your vulnerabilities, okay? You need to be able to control your vulnerabilities in order to prevent the threats from exploiting them. So let's talk about the 0-day vulnerabilities for a second. The 0-day, as I hear it from time to time, 0-day is considered as a malware or some malicious code that is 0-day. So it's important to correct this wrong perception of the quote-unquote 0-day. The 0-day is the 0-day from detection of a vulnerability. 0-day from detection means that no one knows, or not officially knows about this. Maybe some hackers, some hacking group know about this 0-day, this vulnerability, but no official vendor that needs to actually provide the patch or do something about it actually knows about it. So it's 0-day from detection, because when the detection takes place, now it's not 0-day. So we start counting the days. Day 1 from detection, day 2 from detection, day 70 from detection, and then the vendor comes up and says, okay, I have the official patch for this vulnerability. Up until that point, from detection, all we can do is rely on compensating controls. So not the actual controls that will deal with this vulnerability, but other controls that we can rely on. Let's check the chat room. No questions there. You guys are being great today. Very quiet. That's good. No, I want you to ask questions, so ask away, please. Exploits. Exploits are also treated as a certain malware or as a certain problem, which again is doing giving the wrong impression on the actual meaning of the exploit when we talk about security. So an exploit will be, and I'm going back to vulnerabilities and threats, an exploit will be the action of a threat against vulnerability, okay? So it's important to understand a threat will exploit a vulnerability, okay? A threat will exploit a vulnerability. That means that the exploit is the action of a threat against vulnerability. So when ISC asks you a question about an exploit, ask yourself, what is my vulnerability? What can make it better? Okay, this is really important because a threat will not exploit anything that is not a vulnerability. Okay, so an exploit only operates against a vulnerability. Now, talking about a probability that we mentioned before is we have many variables connected to the word probability, which can also appear in your CISSP exam as the word likelihood. Okay, ISC can use the word likelihood in parallel to probability or instead of probability. So don't confuse them. Remember that these two are the same word. Now, the probability is basically asking ourselves the question of, how capable is the threat against the vulnerability, or the threat agent against the vulnerability, how motivated they are, and how easy it is to exploit our vulnerability. These kind of questions will lead you to understanding the right probability, or the right level of probability. And in probability, the levels can be between 0% and 100%, or between the number 0 and the number 1, because 1 represents the 100%. Okay, so don't confuse that with numbers if you get anything related to numbers in your CISSP, but that's a remote possibility that you'll get probability in numbers of that between 0 and 1. Okay, normally it's percentage. And then when we talk about the impact, or we talk about the damage and the bad things that can happen to our organization or to our systems, the impact can be an impact that is system focused or data focused. So it's either we're talking about a system that is impacted, or data that is impacted because of a threat risk materialization because of a threat, exploiting a vulnerability and creating the probability that relate to the impact that we identified here. So again, an impact is on the system or the data or even both. It can exist in both. And then on top of all that, we look at the risk ownership, because as a CISSP, our job is to analyze and present the map of risks related to information security, related to the C, I, and A of the information, of the data, and the DAD that can happen to this information. But it's not our decision when we don't own the data on what to do about these risks. We are merely the consultants, quote unquote, of the organization. As a CISSP, we cannot make a decision on someone else's information and someone else's data. This is ownership, and ownership creates accountability, and we have risk owners in our organization. It's really important to remember that throughout your CISSP. In your CISSP, you don't take actions. You just make notification. You let the owner know what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and then they make the decision on how to solve it. Maybe they want to say, okay, I can live with this risk. If you come back and say, well, it only cost us $10,000 to fix this risk and maybe even completely eliminate that. Maybe it's a good idea, but you know what? It's the end of the quarter. I'm worried about my bonus. Don't do anything about it. Don't spend the $10,000. That's it. You need to live with that. You need to live and know how to deal with this type of decision, because you're not the owner of the asset, of the information. You're not the owner of the data. So I hope it makes sense, because we need to make sure that throughout the CISSP, you consider this as a no-game zone for you as a CISSP. You cannot cross this boundary between a security professional and the one that actually will do the job of remediating the risks, unless the risk owner directs you on remediating the risks. Okay, remember this throughout your exam. You are there to consult. You're there to give an advice, to give direction. You're not there to close the gaps for them, because we don't really know everything that we need to know about the business. Now, the next part is really important for domain one, and domain one understanding is everything. This one is everything related to risk analysis. When we do risk analysis as CISSPs, and as I mentioned that we want to bring the information in front of the organization to make sure that they actually know what's happening in their information security realm. When we run the risk analysis, we can take the quantitative approach, which is more of a monetary and numbers approach, and the qualitative approach. The best way to run a risk analysis according to the CISSP and according to real life as well, to be honest, is to create a hybrid approach that will use both quantitative and qualitative methods. So what we're going to do in the next few slides, we're going to start looking at the quantitative risk analysis, which can be kind of confusing a little bit. It's not too complex math, but when you enter your exam in your CISSP and everything is theoretical and everything is a story that they tell you, and all of a sudden you come across a few questions with numbers, this can be a bit frustrating to some of us. And I prepared also a whiteboard slide at the end of this part, part of quantitative risk analysis that might be helpful for some of you to take with you to the exam when they get to this annoying question of calculations. Again, which is not too difficult. It's not a university type of math. It's more of a third grade, fourth grade type of math. So let's look at the quantitative risk analysis. When we do quantitative risk analysis, we want to get to hard values and percentages, numbers that the organization can work with in order to consider the risks and how to address those risks. The first part we're going to talk about are the three variables called AV, EF, and SLE. The first one, AV, is the asset value. Asset value is the value of that asset for the organization and in the eyes of the organization. So this is really important to remember. The asset value is almost always throughout the CISSP given to us by the organization. We don't make it up. We don't decide on it. It's something that the CFO/CEO/COO/C, whatever it is that is not us, gives us in order for us to calculate the risks related to that asset. It's a number, pure number. And then the exposure factor, EF, the second variable, means that when something happens, the worst thing that you can imagine happens to that asset, what does that mean on the productivity of that asset? For example, I have a server that is worth $10 million for the organization. One server that is worth $10 million. I cannot even imagine what this server holds, but let's say we have something like that. Now, the exposure factor says that if the worst thing that will happen to the server will bring down productivity to 66%. Okay, so it will bring down productivity to 66%. This is opposite from the example that you have here. But if it brings down productivity to 66%, that means that the exposure factor is 34%. That means that our productivity dropped by the exposure factor. Productivity dropped by 34%. And now we have the server working only in 66% of its capability. If we say that exposure factor is 0.2, that means 20%. That means that the productivity is dropped to 80%. So we have a system that works in 80% of its capability in the worst case scenario. If we say the opposite, EF equals 0.8, that means that the system works in only 20% of its capability. I hope it makes sense, but think of it this way. Any number that will be given to you in the exposure factor, the ISC and the CISSP exam will try to manipulate your brain into thinking the opposite, okay? So ISC will try to, in their questions, in their own way, in beautiful way, to manipulate your brain to think of the 20% as the exposure factor and the 80% as the productivity level of your system. So what you need to ask yourself is, how much do I still have to work with? Okay, what is the percentage that I can still rely on that is working properly? Maybe it's 0, maybe it's completely gone, and the exposure factor is 100%. So I hope it makes sense to you. If not, you can always go back to this part of the session and listen to it again. And I can assure that there's a lot about this in the book of the CISSP. Now, the third variable is the SLE. SLE stands for single loss expectancy. That means that in one event, single event, not an annual event, not in a monthly event, but just one event, what will be the impact of the organization, monetary impact? So the SLE equals asset value, which we got from the asset, times exposure factor. So if the asset value was $100,000 and the exposure factor, that means that in worst case scenario, our system will operate in 80% of its capability. That means that our EF is 0.2. So our SLE, single loss expectancy, one event throughout the lifetime of the asset, will be $20,000. So in order for us to deal with this single event, we will need to put up to $20,000. But this is not the end of the quantitative risk analysis, because from here on, we have two more variables, the ARO and the ALE. So the ARO stands for annualized rate of occurrence. And here we ask ourselves, how many times throughout the year this worst case scenario will actually take place? And since we might experience ransomware before, and we know that we get hit by ransomware every couple of years, so our ARO will be 0.5. If it happens once a year, then the ARO equals 1. If it happens, unfortunately, 4 times a year, then our ARO equals 4. And what it means is that you need to consider the multiple years that they can ask about. They can ask about the ARO that can be equal to 0.1 or 0.01. So if ARO equals 0.01, that means that your event takes place every 100 years. Okay, it's really important to remember this, because this is where they toy with your brain and your analytical brain. After you solve all these questions, you get to this type of question, and you confuse between the percentage of what you're left with and what you're not left with, the exposure factor and other variables here, for example, the ARO. Now, the other one is the ALE, and this is the last one for this 5. ALE is the annualized loss expectancy. So take the SLE times ARO. So if the SLE was $20,000 and the rate of occurrence of that specific worst case scenario is 3 times a year, that means that our ALE now, annualized loss expectancy, is $60,000. That means that we're going to spend in 1 year up to $60,000 to minimize this risk. Okay, but the game of math of the CISSP does not end there, because after understanding these 5 variables, now we ask the question, does it worth it? Okay, is it worth it to implement anything given that specific ALE? So the question we ask here is, what is the ALE before the implementation of controls? We talked about implementing controls against vulnerability, right? This is the part that we can actually work on. Now, we don't want to just spend money because we want to think business, because businesses care about business. And we want to minimize losses and increase benefit or profit. So before we go and spend $60,000, let's ask yourself, if I spend this much money on a control, let's say $59,000, but then, so it makes sense, if the risk is $60,000 and the control that I can purchase will cost me $59,000, then I saved $1,000, right? So CISSP comes and say, wrong, because you still have the annual cost of your safeguard. You have people, you have training, you have legal department looking at the contract with the vendor, and even if the control is given to you for free, and look for that in your questions, a control is given to you for free for a risk that is worth $60,000. Will you take it? Would you implement it? Your answer needs to be, what is my ACS? What is my annual cost of safeguard? How much will it cost me to maintain this control? Maybe it'll cost me $100,000. Then it doesn't make sense, right? Even if the control is free of charge, even if the control is given to me free by a vendor, I still need to make sure that the value of the safeguard is a positive figure. It cannot be negative. If it's negative, then it doesn't make sense to even work on this risk. And it doesn't even make sense to operate against this risk. And that means that the ALE1, the first one ALE, is something we need to accept as a risk. We need to make sure management understands that it will cost more to deal with this risk than to actually live with it. Maybe they want to to have an insurance against it. Maybe they want to do something else about it. Maybe they'll decide to actually go and work against it, even if it doesn't make monetary sense. But as we mentioned before, it's not our CISSP decision to make. It's the senior management decision to make on how to operate against risks. Now, in order for you to remember all these equations together, I put together this whiteboard for you, which details all the 4 equations that you will need to remember for the quantitative risk analysis in your CISSP. Only 4. So the SLE equals asset value times exposure factor. The ARO is the times per year annualized. Okay, remember the A at the beginning is annualized, and then the ALE is annualized loss expectancy, SLE times ARO. And then the cost and benefit, when you consider cost and benefit of whether to implement the control, is the first ALE minus the second ALE, the ALE before implementing the control, and the ALE after implementing the control, also minus ACS. And if this all is a positive number, then we move forward and implement this control. If it's a negative number, then we don't move forward with this. We bring it to management decision to make a decision here on whether to move forward with this control. I hope it makes sense. And let's check the chat room to see if we have anyone asking any question. I see that everything is clear and you're all on top of your game here, and I couldn't be more proud. So I see that everything is clear. Awesome. Let's move forward with this. And this first part, which is really important for your CISSP, because in any exam of the CISSP, you will end up having this whiteboard, or this whiteboard in your questions. You will have several questions around this whiteboard. So have it with you, have it between your ears, memorize it, and when you walk into the CISSP exam, just throw it on the whiteboard so you can have it with you throughout the exam and whenever this questions comes up. This was the first part of the risk analysis, the quantitative. The easier one is the qualitative risk analysis. And in the qualitative risk analysis, we basically ask the question of, what is my heat map? What is the map that, is it high risk, low risk, medium risk, and how do I get to treat these risks without having the hard numbers or hard volume numbers behind this qualitative analysis. So think of it this way. We have impact on one side and likelihood on the other side. And they rank from high to low, and they create a heat map. And when we say there's a high impact and a high likelihood, this is a high ranked risk. Now, also, we can have high ranked risk for medium impact or medium likelihood and high medium likelihood on the other side. But this is based on the risk appetite of the organization. Now, how do you decide on the risk and the qualitative risk analysis? You go out to the public, you go out to the organization, and you ask them questions. In your book, in the CISSP, there are several techniques, and the one that we constantly see in exams is the Delphi technique. However, in your book, there are 5 or 6 more techniques which I highly recommend in getting familiarized with. One of them is Monte Carlo, and others there as well. So get familiarized with the technique, but the Delphi technique is the one that is we see it more often than others. And what the Delphi techniques means is that we conduct an anonymous survey throughout the organization, throughout several key personnel in the organization, to get their perspective on a list of risks or the risk approach that we want to bring to the organization. They can say, okay, I think this risk is high, this asset is critical, or whatever they say, we want to take them as a group. We want to process this information and put it together in order for us to get the wisdom of the people in our organization. If you may, the Delphi technique is almost equal to crowdsourcing of your qualitative risk analysis. Now, the last slide for today is when we put the two together, the quantitative risk analysis and the qualitative risk analysis, one against the other. As you can see, there are advantages on each one of them, and the other side is disadvantages. So we don't want to remember the disadvantages of each side. We just want to memorize the advantages and take what we call the best of breed of both to conduct the proper risk analysis. So the best risk analysis will be to combine between qualitative and quantitative approach together in order for us to get to the value, the real value of the risk. So, for example, if I take the quantitative advantage when it's tied to numbers or money, yet the qualitative advantage is easier to perform, I can probably work with the qualitative side on the probability and ask people throughout the organization what do they think about the probability of some major incident in cybersecurity to take place, even though we didn't experience that before. We don't have the ARO, we don't have ALE for that. And then when we go to the hard numbers and we look at we do the quantitative risk analysis for the impact, then combining the two, the probability on one side and the impact on the other side, we can get to better and more accurate view of our risks. So remember, for your CISSP exam, combining the qualitative and quantitative together is the right way to do your risk analysis. Let's look at another slide. I hope I know I mentioned that this one will be the last one for today, but as we talk about risks, I just want to mention another thing to consider, to remember, the KRI, the key risk indicators. The key risk indicators are there to indicate a change in the overall risk. So in your CISSP exam, when they talk about assessing the risks and analyzing the risk, and this is why I wanted to connect this to today's session, is because when we're done with analyzing the risks, we want to make sure we have the right KRIs out there. For example, we want to make sure that we work with the HR department when we talk about data leakage risks. Okay, we analyze the risk, we have a number, we know how to work against this risk, but do we know of any changes in the landscape of the risk? Maybe it's a risk, data leakage risk, is a risk that we decided to accept with management. We had a discussion, we looked at the controls, and we decided to accept this risk for now. The question is, what if our company is developing a software? This is what we do, this is what we sell software. And then in any given month, we have an average of one employee leaving the company from the R&D team, from the developers team. Now, this happens throughout the organization's life cycle, right? Every month, this is the average. But what if in 1 month, all of a sudden we have 10 people, so 10 times the average, 10 people leaving the development team? Wouldn't that make a difference in the approach of a data leakage risk in the eyes of the organization? Of course it will. That's why we have to have KRIs out there to indicate the change or the potential change of a risk posture. For this one, for this example that I just gave, we will probably work with the HR department so they can notify us on any anomaly that happens in the organization that can influence our risk rating. And this will be something that we will bring in front of the senior management, and we will make decision right there on the spot on how to tackle that risk, on how to address that risk or potential change of risk. Nothing happened yet, but as you know, we want to be proactive in security, not reactive. Guys, thank you for this session today, and I hope it really made sense to most, if not all of you. And I know it can be difficult from time to time to deal with this type of questions, the risk formula and the quantitative risk analysis. I highly suggest and recommend to go back to this session and listen to it again, and try to memorize the white words as hard as you can, because this will be in your exam. Next week, we will talk more about risks, and we'll probably complete domain 1 next week, Monday, 5 o'clock Israel time. Love to see you there. Take care, everybody, and have a good night.